Hello again. Welcome back to World War II TV. This is the second of a double bill of shows for you today. And as you all know, we are our second show into New Zealand at War Week. And this is the first week of New Zealand at War. We'll have another one later in the year at some point. Because for those who've been following me for some time, we found a few Australian historians quite early on. Then I just kind of couldn't make any inroads into the Kiwi community. But now I have. And so like waiting for buses, one came along, then two or three others came along behind. So it's great. So we are back to New Zealand, but we're also back to the aviation war today. And it's one of those subjects that always proves to be interesting. People love hearing about Lancasters and Spitfires and air campaigns around the world. So today, a slightly different guest in that my guest is the head of a project about today's subject rather than necessarily an author of a book about him. Although clearly I've just had a chat with him. He absolutely knows the subject inside out. And we are talking about Phil Lammerson, a very famous, in certain areas, Royal New Zealand Air Force pilot. And we're going to bring Mike Harold in now as a guest. So it's evening where you are. It's morning where I am. So good evening, Mike. How are you today?
Yes, good morning there, Paul. Lovely to be with you this evening from Nuremberg, New Zealand, the old home of Phil Lammerson for the last 60 years of his life. So, yeah, wintry night in Nuremberg. Better where you are, no doubt. But yeah, a joy to share aspects of Phil's story with the fraternity that are interested out there.
Brilliant. So, as I said in the top of the show there, a famous flyer, and you are part of this project. So before we talk about Phil himself, tell us a little bit about the project and when it was set up and what its aims are and how you are involved personally.
Well, very briefly, Paul, I got involved. We've known the Lammerson family throughout our lives. They were neighbourhood farming people. I grew up on a farm. So did the Lammerson family, who are my generation. My father was like Phil Lammerson. He went to the Second World War. They farmed in the same district. So we've known the family for a long time. What we also knew was Phil was, just a neighbour who had an interesting war story that no one ever asked about and he never talked about. And I think people of his generation basically respected his judgment not to be involved in Anzac and commemorative things. And basically, he was a man of stature and a man of mana in our community, as our Māori people would say. Towards the end of his life, he did start to talk to people in more detail about his experiences in World War II. And one of the colleagues I was working with as a teacher at that time, even though we still had farming interests, I was also teaching school. And one of my colleagues was a close friend, and he started to unload his story to her. And after Phil died, we got together with the Lammerson family and said, look, it's important that this story be documented and the biography written. So at that point in time, we formed a trust called the Phil Lammerson Heritage Centre Trust. It's a charitable trust here in Nuremberg, and we set about as our initial project to get that biography written. And what happened, Paul, as you'll be well aware, that was really just a beginning. It has become a worldwide conversation, and we've now got a network of people throughout the world who are connected in some way or other to the story, and we're just thrilled to have been part of that. And as I say, we now, it's like peeling an onion. We've got down to newer understandings of the depth of his story and the complexity of parts of it as well. And hopefully we've done his legacy proud. The family certainly are very thrilled with the job that's been done, and have got a whole lot more interested. Phil was a person who didn't even tell his own family anything about his war experiences. So, for us, that's been a journey in itself, getting them to know it as well as we have become so familiar with it. So, thrilled to be with you. As I say, it's about really sharing with you what we know at this point in time, with the understanding that it is still an ongoing conversation. But Phil Lammerson was definitely what we call a reluctant Kiwi war hero. There's no two ways about it. He even, as an old man, was reluctant to talk about it, but actually did. So we're fortuitous that actually happened. So I'll just launch into my thoughts. Paul, as I say, we're farming neighbours, and the trust was set up. Tonight, what I thought we'd try and look at, considering the complexity and the scope of the story, I just thought we'd boil it down to 4 areas. One, have a quick look at his upbringing, which was interesting in itself. You know, the forming of the man. Why was he the person he became? And then look a little bit in detail at his wartime flying experiences, and then especially hone in on the leadership qualities that he displayed when he was in captive with 168 Allied Airmen, wrongly so, in the dreadful Buchenwald camp of near Weimar in Germany. And then I just thought we'd finish off with perhaps a topic that's particularly of interest to modern viewers, might be about, you know, managing trauma, you know, the PTSD sort of thing, just to touch on that, because I think there are probably some interesting points to be made and learn from that as well. So if you're happy to sort of truck along on those routes, we'll go down that path. Yeah.
I'll just say, Mike, that we will do questions at the end, and I honestly think we will cover most of this during the presentation. I've had a look at the PowerPoint, and it's pretty comprehensive. So we will do questions at the end if they're kind of big ones. If little detail ones come up about stuff that's on screen, we'll fire away and we'll answer them as we go along. But it's really interesting, and we talked about it before going online, folks, is that a lot of flyers, their experiences of the war is from height. They're flying over everything. They're never quite in the war itself. They're above the war. And what's so extraordinary about this story is that he got to see it from multiple different angles and avenues, which gave him that kind of insight. And you were saying also, we'll touch on this later, that when he was starting to talk about the war, he would do his own research as well, which I think is really extraordinary. We had the show about Spike Milligan a couple of years ago, how when he was writing his comedy memoirs, he would make sure he'd research the war diaries and research the actual actions. And people are now using his funny writing to actually support the battle, because he did the groundwork and did the research. So a very interesting chat, but we'll hand it back to you and I'll let you take us through the presentation.
Thanks, Paul. And we'll touch on that again later as part of the conversation, I'm sure, because it's intriguing, just knowing the man as we did. So just as we kick in, I just must acknowledge that the Lammersons, Phil Lammerson had bad luck and good luck in the war. He also had it in life after the war, one of which was their house was burnt. I remember seeing it as a pile of ash and wrinkled corrugated iron in the paddock one Sunday morning. The children were lucky to get out. All survived, but the house was burnt down. And unfortunately, in that incident, they lost all the primary records, like Phil's logbooks, which were apparently in a trunk up on the ceiling of the house, and his medals and everything were in the trunk. He never bothered about them. But we heard from his oldest daughter, she used to love climbing up the ladder and with a torch reading his old diary. But that was when she was a child, and she didn't have a lot of recollection of it. But beyond that, we had no primary sources. So we relied on a whole lot of other sources. Now, Phil's story has been covered or touched on in a lot of publications, as people would be aware, and we are absolutely in debt as a trust to the people who have enabled us to use those resources to add to our understanding and the depth of knowledge we now have about this man who was in some ways a quintessential quiet farming New Zealander who just got on with his life. But we're also, had very appreciative of the records that have been held with the squadrons, the briefings, the records that were kept at the end of the war, and also diaries like Phil's colleague, the navigator who was in, Ken Chapman, Chappie Chapman, who experienced Buchenwald with Phil. He was the only person who knew when he went there, and he also wrote diaries, a diary which was an important resource for our understanding of this whole story. So we want to acknowledge those people as part of what we are presenting tonight as well. So I thought I'd just start by having a look briefly at his upbringing and some of the key points of that. Probably the most important figure in Phil's early life was his father, William Lammerson. Now, William Lammerson was an interesting man. His parents had come to New Zealand with the gold rushes, and they ended up on the rugged west coast of the South Island, where life was really rough and tumble in the gold field. Now, despite that, William Lammerson actually got a good education at the school compared with kids of his time, but he was tough, he was austere, and he was uncompromising. But he was also educated, and he became a draftsman, so he valued education. when he was adult, he got into the Brethren religious fraternity, and it was driven by doctrine and zeal, and he became a very disciplinarian man. So, it was sort of spare the rod and spoil the child very much in the Lammerson household, especially for the three boys, Phil being the second boy. He struggled with that. He was a free spirit. He was a person who liked to be his own independent self right from the get-go. And so he clashed with his dad throughout his childhood and into his young adulthood. So that he was an important formative person in Phil's life. Then there was, Phil himself. He was born in 1918. He was the fourth child in a family of six. They were living in Napier in New Zealand, just in the Hawke's Bay, not far from where we live here in the east of the North Island. And as I mentioned, Phil Lammerson, was a free-spirited person, non-academic at school, disliked books totally, but good at sports, like so many New Zealanders still, even to this day, love their sport. And he was especially adept with boxing, to the point where he had his nose broken, I think, 6 times by the time he'd finished at high school. So he was fearless, and I think that's where he learned to not step back, which became, a bit of a mantra for him in his wartime story. So, however, through that time also, he developed a habit of being quite facetious, and flippant, cheeky, I suppose the master would have called it, as all boys school, especially towards authoritarian masters, people who overuse their power a wee bit with the kids. And so he took a lot of caning for that, and he would be quite flippant and facetious and never flinch. And he sort of became a bit of a cult hero with his mates, So that was really the big triumph of his schooling, was goading masters and becoming a cult hero with his friends. And then he also developed through that time, and we're not sure how, he became determined to be a farmer. I know the school did have a bit of land, maybe it was through that, but that seemed to be his only contact with farming at that point in his life. Absolutely determined to be a farmer. So for a town kid to become a farmer without any contacts in New Zealand, that was almost an impossibility. So in defiance of his father's wishes, Phil applied himself at age 15 to become a farm cadet at what still is called the Smedley Training Farm in Hawke's Bay, in the hill country of Hawke's Bay. And so it was, and he got in, much to everyone's surprise, he got in. And so, not surprisingly, he found his niche there. He was really interested, he was challenged. He got that sense of freedom. He got that sense of independence, that sense of being man alone, with a horse and dog out in the hills. It was really quintessential, early New Zealand sort of egalitarian sort of thinking, So the interesting thing was that, farming was the catalyst to him becoming quite successful academically. And he topped his class. His name's there on the honours board up at the training farm still. And that gave him the opportunity to go and complete a tertiary diploma in farming, which he completed after 2 years in 1937. So, he had a brain in his head. Phil Lammerson wasn't just a guy who did boxing and rugby. He was a guy who also was a very intelligent man. And I think, often that was perhaps overlooked. He commenced work as a farm livestock inspector. He couldn't get straight into farming, so he got a job with the New Zealand Department of Agriculture over in Taranaki, around New Plymouth area, on the opposite side of the North Island from where we live. And he continued his involvement in sports there as he worked, especially in rugby. And you can see from that photo there that he's clearly almost head and shoulders above most of the other guys on the team. So he was becoming quite a physical presence, strong and sturdy in stature, and so that was an important aspect of his being, even to an old age. He had that physical stature. So it was there also in that time in Taranaki that he began to develop an interest in flying. I think it was through owning a motorbike or something. Originally, he got interested in machinery, and that led into an interest in flying. He never learnt to fly, but he used to go flying with people he knew. So he grew to enjoy it. There are a couple of traumatic experiences in Phil's upbringing which are worthy of quickly noticing in passing. First one, sorry.
Just wanted to interrupt for a second. We've done other shows with people like Dilip Sarkar, and it's always worth reminding ourselves in the 1930s, flying was still something that was an adventurer. It was a kind of rebellious thing. I think we think of flying now as just kind of long distance commuting. It's lost a bit of its kind of excitement unless you go to air shows. But back in the 30s, so many of World War II's heroes, they found that avenue because flying was something to do. It was exciting. It was new. It was machinery. It was going, and it was another form of exploration, wasn't it? It's exploration upwards rather than exploration. So I think just worth pausing and mentioning just how different flying was perceived in that era than today.
Yeah, and just adding to that, digging down, as I say, into Phil's life, there was an anecdote of that time when Phil was courting his long-time girlfriend who was living in Napier. And in those days, of course, it was probably 2 days on a rail wagon, to get to Napier from where he was living. So he coaxed his instructor at the New Plymouth Aero Club to take him across the North Island and back in a gypsy moth. Well, you can imagine that and the wind and that we get in New Zealand. And they apparently ran out of fuel on the way back, and they dropped the plane down into a farmer's paddock and put farm fuel out of a can into the airplane to get them safely home. So, there was a sense of adventure about him as well in those early days, and it was relating to flying. So, he liked a bit of, he was a guy who liked a little bit of being the larrikin and a bit of the, bit of challenge around that as well. So, but, just talking about his upbringing, there was the Hawke's Bay earthquake, which even today was one of New Zealand's worst natural disasters. It wrecked the town of Napier where they lived. They were not affected too badly, but it meant that he was sort of out of town for quite some time as a child. It was a traumatic experience for the whole of the town. Over 250 people were killed in that event. And then when he was 18, his father was killed in what we call a level crossing accident here in New Zealand, a railway crossing in a motor vehicle one night in March 1936. These were the years of the Great Depression when things were tough enough without having those sort of setbacks. So, they were things that Phil experienced as a young man growing up. When war broke out in September, it was just after his 21st birthday, and Phil, like a lot of New Zealanders, volunteered for military service, and he, because of his interest in flying, volunteered to be in the Air Force. However, the start of his training was actually delayed almost 12 months because he required medical attention to be made to his nose because of the broken noses that he had. One of his defining features, even in that picture of him as a young man there, when the nose would have just been fixed, was this badly damaged nose from the boxing days, and so it had to be fixed before he could get into a career in the Air Force. So he endured that, and it took some time. And I think they all got excited by reports about the Battle of Britain during that time when that was happening. When he was eventually into the flying, he was really excited about it. And it was at New Plymouth that he got his elementary flying done, and they were working with gypsy moths, which had really been seconded out of the Aero clubs at that time in New Zealand. The RNZAF was quite ill prepared for even training people for the war, So, so we are, he went on to advanced training over here at RNZAF at Hawke, which is still a major air base in New Zealand. And they were using the twin-engine airspeed Oxfords there. They had nothing larger than that. The bombers that had been put on order had been kept back for Bomber Command in England and used by 75 Squadron. So, he didn't get into the really heavy aircraft until he finally got to England. He was awarded his wings in March 1941, and it's interesting. I think he passed with a 75% grading, and the instructor noted that he was an average student who merits a commission after some more service experience. So even in those early days, there was an insight, in the aviation world anyway, that this man had leadership potential, and it was definitely one of the reasons why he ended up going into Bomber Command. I know Phil, like a lot of young New Zealanders at the time, wanted to fly a Spitfire, and there was an anecdote about how he tried to argue that when he first got to England and spent a couple of nights in the cooler over it. There was, they had bigger plans for people with those leadership capabilities, and it was really in the bomber crews. So that was where he was destined to go. He married his childhood sweetheart, Joan Hopkins, in Napier on the 29th of March, 1941. There with his wings on in the wedding photo, proudly, having earned them just a couple of weeks before. And then departed New Zealand before the end of April. They went by sea up through the North American continent and arrived in the UK at the end of June 1941, ready for war service. So all his preparatory flying to that point in time had been done in New Zealand. And throughout those formative years, Paul, I guess Phil was developing what became a bit of a mantra for him, which even in old age, he sort of, had a wry smile when he talked about. I've always been a bit facetious, but I always was reliable and did what I had to do to the very best of my ability. And that was very much one of the things that he prided himself on being like throughout his life. I think that was very much in place by the time he went off to war. Just having sort of covered a little bit of his, formative years, I thought we'd just have a quick look at his war service. And it's interesting, he did comment once to I think a medical person in Canada or somewhere, where he was being part of some PSD sort of post-traumatic sort of survey going on, that he volunteered not out of any sense of patriotism, but just for the hell of it and for the love of flying. So that was his sole intent in getting involved in World War II. His operational flying service with RAF Bomber Command started on 21st of September 1941 with 218 Squadron at Marham. Prior to that, he spent around about 6 weeks at Pershore at number 23 Squadron, where they'd learned to fly the larger aircraft, the Wellingtons, and that's what he went on to when he was at 218. So the interesting thing there historically was that just about 3 days before he joined that squadron, the Butt report was released. And of course, that was the report that questioned the whole future of Bomber Command. Real concerns were being raised about the ineffectiveness of the inaccuracies of the bombing, and also the losses both of men and aircraft. And they realized it was not sustainable. And so one of the first major, I think Phil did some dicky seat riding, initially after he got in the squadron, and it was sort of late in October. There was some bad weather sort of affected a lot of the missions, and he did his first real major op towards the end of October. And no sooner had he done that than he was involved in what was Richard Pearce, who was the commander of Bomber Command at the time, sort of like a last throw of the dice in his response to the bad findings of the Butt report. He decided, well, we'll mount a big raid, and part of that was to send 169 aircraft to Berlin. And Phil was nominated as one of the, I think there were 9 aircraft, went from 7 aircraft. No, that night there were 13, went from 218 Squadron. And they all came back, but, he was lucky. It was a big flight. You're right at the top end of the range for the Wellington bombers, of course. But 21 failed to return of those 169, and very few made the target. And so immediately after that, the Air Ministry put Bomber Command on notice to restrict bombing raids. And so, no sooner had Phil arrived in England, all geared up to get involved in things, and then it became, sort of trundling around doing lesser raids for some period of time. So that was his experience in the Wellington bombers. And then he, during February, the squadron had fully transitioned into Stirlings, the heavier 4-engine aircraft. And Phil actually quickly became a person with a high level of competence with that aeroplane, which he talked about in some detail about the difficulties and particularly landing and taking off, and the problems that were the challenges around managing that as a pilot and an engineer on board. So he got quite adept, and so he was soon one of the important pilots on the squadron with the bigger bombers. And there were probably 3 operations that are worth mentioning here tonight. He flew a lot down Happy Valley, and Essen. I think they went there 4 times. But on 28th of March, Bomber Harris had been newly put into the seat. He'd been there about 2 weeks, and he wanted to test his bomber screening plan. And they singled out Lübeck as a soft target, basically, and it was probably the first civilian target, with the aim to damage and damage the civilian people and lower German morale. So 234 bombers were sent to just create a conflagration in that city, which was very successfully done. And Phil was one of the Lammerson crew flew that night on a mission that later sort of became controversial and a source of some propaganda value for the Germans, given the way the British had changed tact on not just targeting these strategic targets. So, you take the good with the bad. And Phil was asked about that. Did he ever think about it? But he said, not really. At that time in his career, that was not one of the things they considered too much. Then, importantly, you talking about Pilsen. Well, Pilsen was important. And so Phil Lammerson was chosen as his crew was chosen as one of 7 from 218 Squadron to fly as part of what was Operation Cannonberry, which was basically to target the Skoda armament works in Pilsen, in Czechoslovakia, and it was a long flight right over Germany. So it was initially they went out on the 25th of April, and Phil talked in detail in that interview that I spoke about earlier about this particular experience, and they were. They were attacked. They lost an aircraft on the way out, which was only found after the war. And then they got to the target, and it was cloudy, and so they released the bombs inaccurately, and so they got back okay, and they were sent back a second time on the 2nd of May, and similar weather conditions when they got there. So he decided he would fly back round the Rhine. And he came in over Mannheim on the docks and let his bombs go there. And as he said, he got by the time he got out of that, he was caught in the cone, and he was hammered by night fighters. And there was one very tenacious night fighter shot them up quite badly. They lost their turrets, and the plane was actually on fire. One of the incendiaries stored in the aircraft had caused a fire, and that had to be put out by the engineer, the flight engineer, and so all the time Phil was weaving to try and get out of the way of the bomber, and that experience earned him the DFC. Now, there's an interesting anecdote beside that. Phil talked about it, and he said that the night fighter that followed them and chased them must have ran out of ammunition, but he could see, obviously, he'd seen that he'd shot them quite badly, and that there were no guns operating left on the Sterling, and he said, I looked out to my port, and this guy was sitting beside me, almost on my wingtip, and he was saluting me. Sort of like the Red Baron type stuff. It was that moment of sort of honour among enemies. And the family always called that. That was one of the stories Phil used to tell. He was an interesting anecdote, because that's never ever been followed up on. But it was sort of the honour among enemies, and it was something that really came back in the Buchenwald story. That honour between the flyers was very much in case, and that was those actions earned him the DFC, which he was a bit cynical about, because he felt that the guy who'd put the fire out and used his parachute was probably equally worthy of a DFC, but never got any recognition. He accepted the medal, but he also realised it was really on behalf of his crew. And then at the end of May, it should be there, 31st of April and May, the Operation Millennium, the first and second 1,000 bomber raids. He flew on both of them. Their crew were marker aircraft. First one was very successful, second one not so. And that was one Phil did consider, in terms of loss of life in the civilian population, is what happened that night over Essen. So, flew in some significant operations in those early days at 218. So by August 1942, he completed his first tour of duty, so to speak, through the ops. He was identified as one of the squadron's top 6 pilots, and he was commissioned as a squadron leader in October 1942 to spend the next 14 months, as it turned out, as an instructor at 1657 Conversion Unit at Stradishall. So he went on using those skills that he had as a leader, even in those days. It's interesting, while he was at Stradishall, he was was mentioned in dispatches for his bravery at just in dealing with trainee pilots at times, so not all was smooth sailing there. Even though there are a lot of stories about Phil Lammerson's larrikins recorded in the Stradishall records, squadron records, I think boredom overtook him at times. So, he returned to operational flying in number 15 Squadron at Mildenhorn, January 1944. He was seconded back in where they were transitioning on to Lancasters. He had a much more experienced crew, but then things had changed dramatically. By then, the Battle of Berlin was in full flight. They were flying longer raids, 7 or 8 hours. The targets were more strongly defended. There was more technology in the aircraft and that, so experienced crew was critical to his survival through that time. They flew the pretty dangerous missions. I think there were 3 to Berlin. And I just, for the viewers in New Zealand who are not too familiar with the layout of Europe, I've just put some arrows on the map there tonight to show the sort of, the distances involved. Those concentric circles go out in 100-mile lots. So, a lot of the raiding that was going on at that later time for Phil Lammerson involved a lot of hours in the air, which was, he as the leader of the squadron, he was only on those longer raids. There were other raids happening as well.
And just to interrupt for a second, Mike, just to remind ourselves just what the learning curve was. He was in it, Bomber Command, fairly earlier. The ranges are increasing on almost monthly basis. The Wellington to the Stirling is a big leap. The Stirling to the Lancaster is a big leap. The Rangers are leaping. The crew sizes, everything. We forget how steep the aviation technology increase was in World War II. The Royal Air Force goes from 40% biplanes in 1939 to the Gloucester Meteor jet in 1945. So for someone like Lammerson to be part and influencing and leading in many ways this drive forwards of technology is really quite remarkable.
Yeah, and the other thing, of course, Paul, to consider is that the enemy, of course, the technological growth there was in defence organisation and technology was a similar curve, and so you had to be very vigilant and very, very skilled and experienced to stay alive. Phil Lammerson was asked about this. How did you get on? He said, he said, well, I put it like this. He said, you might be driving down the road and you see a train coming and you think, well, I can get across that railway crossing just before the train gets there. And he said, you'd pedal the car, go across the crossing, look in your rear vision mirror. So you would feel nothing while you were doing it, but you'd look in the rear vision mirror and see the train going across the crossing and think you'd breathe heavily. So he said there were those terror moments that, that were happening all the time. One of those flights, for instance, they were caught in the cone for 22 minutes. And I think they got out of it by doing what he called his power dive, which required them to actually do a vertical drop in a Lancaster, which apparently, I'm not a flyer, so I don't understand this, but the risk of stalling the aircraft as you come out of that is so great that no one bothered to try it. But in desperation, they were the sorts of things his crew was ready to do. And they were all geared up, and so they trained hard on all those sorts of things as well. All these raids, the success of them happened because the crews trained night and day around England, as well. So I'd like to just talk a little bit about the infamous now Nuremberg Raid, and a lot's been written about that in recent years. And I'd like to talk about it because Phil Lammerson by then was a very experienced pilot, and at the head of his in Mildenhall, there was another Kiwi there by the name of Andrew McKee, Square McKee they called him. He was sort of in charge of about 5 squadrons based at Mildenhall. And Phil always respected him as being a person he could actually talk to, and he felt listened to him. And so when he saw the map for the Nuremberg Raid, he was horrified and said, and Square McKee approached him and said, "What do you think?" And he said, "I think this is terrible. We're going to lose a lot of aircraft." And so McKee said, "Do you really?" And he said, "Come with me." And he took him over to his office, and he phoned up Bomber Arthur Harris. And as soon as he got Arthur Harris on the line, he passed the phone to Phil Lammerson and said, "Tell him what you just told me."
Wow.
So he did. He said to him, "You're going to lose a lot of aircraft. There's going to be devastation." He said, "The route's bad. The weather forecast is shocking. This is going to be a horror story." And the interviewer asked Phil, what did Harris do? He said, "Well, I think he listened, but he did nothing, changed nothing." So he said, "We flew on that raid. We were in our wing, they were towards the beginning of the raid. In our wing," Phil said, they were 7 hours flying. He said probably for 5.5 to 6 hours of that, we were actually under pressure and being, hammered, either by flak or mainly by night fighters. They were the only aircraft on that wing to get home. 7 of the 8 aircraft failed to return. Wow. So in all, there were 795. Statistics were overwhelming, and 95 were lost. I think about another 6 half dozen made it back to England, and the crews, survived. But, it was over 100 all up. And it was the worst night of losses in Bomber Command's history, and more airmen lost in one night than the whole of the Battle of Britain. And Phil talked about, the empty beds, in their squadron. He said, the places at the table, just the gaps were horrific. So, others have spoken about the Nuremberg Raid. It was a horrific event, and it ended basically the Battle of Berlin as it was being fought at the time. So worth a mention passing.
Yeah.
And then,
definitely.
Of course, there was the raid that knocked them out, which was as he said, it was a milk run. He said we shouldn't have even been on it, and they'd considered even doing it as a daylight raid. And it was on the rail junction at Massy-Plessieux, which is near Paris. And as he said, they got caught out by a night fighter. Phil always blamed himself on that. He said, "I slowed the aeroplane down because the mosquito, the Pathfinder squadron hadn't arrived, and so they were coming into the Chevreau Valley there, and he said, we were about 30 kilometres away from target, and I had to slow the aeroplane down." He said, "Huge mistake." And the guy who knocked him out, Borches, was actually knocked. I think he took out 6 aircraft that night in the space of about 20 minutes. So they were very organised that particular night, the German defenders, to counter what was coming in. So, yeah, look, he was lucky. Of the crew, 2 of them perished. The 2 gunners, the tail gunner, Tommy Dunk, he was killed, in the actual attack, and then the Scottish guy Robbie Aitken, who was in the mid upper turret, he fought off the intruder, but he managed to he left his jump too late and didn't survive the parachute. So luckily Phil managed to get his the 3 of the crew out, but held the aircraft long enough as the fire took hold on the starboard wing there, and that painting was actually done of that event, and so he managed to hang on, but then he had to rescue his navigator, Chapman, out of the aircraft. That in alone was material that could have been considered for the Victoria Cross. It was extreme bravery. Phil said I threw him out, and then I managed to get out on his tail, and my parachute swung about 6 times, and I hit the ground. So, just sheer good luck. He talked to Glennis about it. He said the plane was an inferno. The heat inside that aeroplane, by the time I got that guy out, he was stuck in the bubble down the front of the vertically falling Lancaster, which was already starting to rotate because the wing had dropped off. So yeah, brave stuff, extremely courageous man, but also loyal to his crew right to the very end. And the interesting thing is, having survived, Chappie was fluent in French, and that was fortuitous. And they were together throughout the rest of the war. After Buchenwald and the other prisoner of war camps, who were the two guys left? Chappie and Phil Lammerson. After all that happened between then and the end of the war, these two men were together then. He was the guy he'd known for 18 months. He'd flown with him a lot. They were friends. Huge respect for each other's abilities, and that was what fate did. So just mention there in passing that Phil actually by then, because it was his last flight of the war, really, he clocked up 1,700 hours of military flying at that time.
And that's incredible, isn't it, Mike? I mean, that's incredible. I mean, that's 70 24-hour days. I mean, we talk about some of the units on World War II TV, some of the commando and airborne units who do a little jump in, do a raid, come out again. That's an incredible amount of time, not always in danger, but these long missions into Germany, it's incredible bravery and just mental fortitude.
It's hard enough to sit in a modern airliner for 3 hours.
Yeah.
It does. You're reminded of these were young men. They had to be young men, to cope, or young people, to cope with this. So yeah, look, the story of his evasion again has been well documented in different publications, and huge respect to the French resistance people, who over a 6 weeks period looked after him as they moved him into the Comet line. Ironically, during that time, Phil was awarded a second DFC, just for the big raids that he'd been flying, particularly Berlin. He'd been there 3 times with 15 Squadron. He went twice with the 218 Squadron. But Happy Valley was commonplace, and big raids over well-defended targets, and that was what that DFC was for. Acknowledgement of his courage and determination, really, to make target. But however, like many of these airmen at the time, they were betrayed by infiltrators who were also very skilled workers, and there were a couple of them. And de Soubre was one. For a long time, they thought that it was de Soubre who'd actually been the one who'd infiltrated and got Phil and Chappie, but it was actually another guy, and his name just escapes me. I'll get it in a minute. It'll come back to me. But, a colleague of his, who worked in a similar way, very suave, multilingual, and ticked all the boxes, but were basically on the payroll of the Gestapo. And so they were snaffled up, and Gestapo interrogation. They were only interrogated the once, both of them. They were obviously not categorised as too important at that stage of their career. And they were categorised, like all of them, as terror flies, and the Germans had had enough of them bombing their towns by then, I suppose. And he was incarcerated in Fresnes Prison in Paris, or just out of Paris, where I think they spent about 5 weeks. So, that sort of leads now into his leadership conversation, so I'll just have a quick sip of a drink.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely fantastic. We're absolutely loving it. The comments in the sidebar are loving the presentation and the detail there. So, yeah, absolutely amazing stuff, Mike. I'm so glad I found you as a presenter.
Oh, thanks for that. Yeah. As I say, it's just been a joy to thought, we, for years, we knew Phil Lammerson. I treasure a comment he made to me when I was a kid of about 15. I was playing rugby, and he went up and played his old alma mater school. And we were a co-ed school here. We had good rugby teams at the time, though. We went up there, and I was playing at the fullback position. And I recall getting hammered all day. And Phil was bringing us home in his car, and I was just about asleep, sitting beside him in the front seat. And he leaned over to me, and he said, "Are you still awake?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "You're actually pretty brave there today." I think it's taken me a lifetime to realise that was probably a comment I should treasure till the grave. He didn't waste words, When he landed at Buchenwald, he he talked about this in his 3-hour conversation with Warren Barton, was the name of the guy, the person I knew through he grew up in this town as well. So Phil made this comment about what happened, or his thoughts about when they arrived on the train platform at Buchenwald in August 1944. He said, "I knew no one other than my navigator, Chappie Chapman. He was the Pommy guy. He was in Londoner, Chappie. This was the case for many in the group. People were looking for someone to tell them what to do. I was surprised how many there were." He sort of said to them all, "Come, anyone's an airman, come over here," and the dogs were trying to chew them to bits and the Germans were screaming, but he called above the crowd and said, "Look, I'm a senior British officer. Anyone's an airman, come over here. We need to be together." So I was surprised how many there were, and I kept inquiring. He's moving among them, who are you and what's your rank? Because they're all in civilian clothes, dirty, grimy from 5 days on the train, unshaven. You can imagine the disabled lot. Most of them totally bewildered. Now, a lot of these fellas were in civilian clothes, so I started organising them right there at the railway line. He just felt that responsibility as a senior officer. I'm not going to waste time. It's just, we've got to do this. We've got to do this. This is, a born instinctive reaction. And I think Phil Lammerson was a person who, even in his farming career, people who knew him said he had that instinctive ability. I was talking to some people here who were associated with him with the local Agricultural and Pastoral Association over some years. He was the chairman there. And they said he had this instinctive ability to set goals, and yet he wouldn't write them down. He'd just be able to communicate them, and everyone would be aboard. He sort of had an innate ability, sort of something you just can't train people for. But there was something about him, and that kicked in. He was very clear thinking when they arrived at that place where others were totally bewildered and shattered, So I think his leadership story in terms of Buchenwald starts with the train journey. And we've only learned more detail around that since the book that we put out was published. They were evacuated out of Fresnes on the 15th of August because basically they could hear the Allied guns at night. The advancing Americans-led, overland approach to retake Europe was getting close. So the Germans emptied Fresnes, and I think they were on the second to last train out. And so it was a 5-day train journey. And of course, they were in the conditions that the Jews travelled into the Holocaust. They were crammed into the, what was it, 8 horses or 40 people was written on the side of the carriages. That's right. And I think Phil said there were 96 crammed into his carriage. So there was really only standing room. Now, there were pivotal moments, I think, on that train journey, and there were 4 of them that I think, are really worth talking about in the context of the fact that Phil, as he said, when he got to Buchenwald, he really only knew one other person. But I think by the time he got to Buchenwald, there were some other people who were starting to ask, who the hell's that guy? Like he's standing up to these thugs, So there was an incident that the Americans noticed, when he confronted the SS officer when they were loading the wagons, when he saw what was happening in the crowd and the way they were stacking them in with very poor, no rations, a couple of buckets, one of water and one for toileting. And he went over to one of the SS officers, stood to attention, saluted him and said, "Look, I'm a British officer, RAF, I'm RNZAF, RAF officer. And I, under the Geneva Agreement, we are prisoners of war and you're treating us like animals, and I demand that we be treated, properly as prisoners." And all he got for that was a whack with a butt of a rifle in the face and in the stomach, and marched back to waiting the line by his own wagon again. But it was noticed by some of the young American guys there who were waiting at that particular wagon. Then when he got on the wagon itself, there was agitation happening. People were because it was a very hot day, midsummer, and they waited most of the day. They were loaded in the morning, but no train came to connect onto the 30 wagons until well into the evening. And so they were sweltering in these oven-like conditions. So he said, he said the people were getting impatient. There was pushing and shoving starting. So he spoke up. He said, look, I'm a senior officer. Most of the people in the wagon were French, but there were some guys who transpired were Allied Airmen there as well. And he said, unless we start working together, some of you are going to be dead here soon, in these conditions. So he started moving them around. He said, like a chess piece. He said it was like a game of chess where I moved them so everyone got a little bit of time by the small aperture, which was allowing some fresh air to come into the wagon. And so things settled down, so he got noticed for that by some in the wagon. Then there was an occasion, and it's well documented, the train, it wasn't a straight train ride. At one stage, the resistance had blown a bridge across the Marne River, and that required the train they were on to be unloaded. Hostages were held while the prisoners were marched something like about 6 to 10 kilometres around a road bridge and back to the rail line on the other side of the river. And they had to carry new straw which they'd picked out of a hay field or something, and for the next train, and also, a lot of the gear that the Germans had stashed in a couple of wagons of that was also shared among the prisoners. Now, it's part of that long ribbon of prisoners stretching across these French fields. There was a frenzied SS guard. He was clearly, as Phil said, the guy was out of his tree. He was behaving really badly, and he had a lump of wood, and he was striking out at the prisoners as they walked past. And he said, just in front of him was a young guy who transpired to be one of the airmen, a British guy who actually died while they were in Buchenwald later, and he had a broken arm and he couldn't carry anything. So Phil sort of intervened, just walked past the guy, brushed past this guy and said, well, I'm not going to get out of your way. And he sort of, ushered the wounded, the injured British airman out of the way. His name was Hemmings. And, there was a conversation happened between these two guys. Phil said, stop bloody treating us like animals. We're prisoners of war. And he said, I started talking to him and said, this is our chance to actually overpower this guy and grab his gun. He said, I was getting a bit gung-ho. He said, by the time, because it caused a consternation, suddenly there were other prisoners around, and another guard came hurrying over, who was a bit like Phil Lammerson. He was strong but cynical. And he said, you take one more pace back this way and I'll have to shoot both of you. But then he also put the other guy's arm in a sling. So there was in one moment in time, there was some compassion. But Phil had basically, again, been noticed by some of the other guys who it transpired were Allied Airmen who hadn't known him before. The American guys couldn't even understand his Kiwi accent, And then finally, I think for Phil, the thing that needs mentioning was, there was a terrible occasion where just in cold blood, there'd been guys lifting the floorboards on the trains that trudged uphill. One or two would slip out and try and escape. And so a carriage was punished. They were stripped and made to go, held at a firing squad and then stood down, all loaded back and naked into the carriage. Chappie Chapman was one of those in that carriage. But there was also a young French resistance guy, probably about 17 years old, in the carriage. And the Germans had said, don't go near the little air inlet, on the carriage. And this guy put his hand out, and the guy shot him through the hand. And so they said, and he was screaming. So they said, bring him out here and we'll fix him. They took him out, and in view of everyone, they executed him. And then they insisted that these naked prisoners get back out and bury him, by the side of the train. So it was all about power. And so Phil actually realised in that moment, he said, I absolutely started to realise what we were dealing with. These SS guys, among them were people who were brutal, callous, cold-blooded, and they were pretty dangerous people to be around. So, there was a whole growth of understanding that went on during that train journey, all that contributed to the leadership that followed in Buchenwald. So, by the time they got there, there were people already knew this big New Zealand guy was a guy that was worth listening to. Probably for people who don't know a lot about Buchenwald, it's worth mentioning a little bit about it. Excuse us, I'll grab another drink. It was in Weimar in Germany. It was operated by the SS as a work death camp. There was a big factory adjacent to it. and an armament factory. A lot of the camp people were employed in that. It was established in 1937 and extended right through the war years. During that time, over 240,000 prisoners probably had been in Buchenwald, and it's estimated between 56,500 and maybe even as many as 60,000 of those prisoners perished through either starvation, illness, execution, or disease. It was one of the really bad places to be. But it was very, very complex, and a lot of people have, talked about that complexity of the camp. Whilst it was SS operated, in fact, it was run by the communist prisoners, who were a sizable group because they'd been put there by the Germans as opponents of Nazism. And they, of course, the nationalities, it was like so many different languages, different groups of people there. And so a big place. I think at the time, I think Mike Dorsey said something to the effect of about 80,000 people were probably in the camp at the time. Phil Lammerson was there. And the power was held by these communists, the day-to-day operations, the administration, and the front of that were the people who were the capos, who were really picked on their brutality. A lot of them were Polish communists who Phil's group were dealing with. And they were incredibly callous people. It was the only way they justified their it was every man for himself in Buchenwald. Survival meant, who you could trample on. And so these capos operated absolutely that way. And so it was a really, really dangerous place to arrive at. And these guys, having been categorized as terror flies, had also been categorized by the Gestapo as decal, which meant that they were basically on a one-way trip, that they were there basically to be executed. So their papers had been stamped with that. When he arrived in Buchan, Phil Lammerson's story is not just about Phil Lammerson. When you get and you dig down in the layers, you find that there was a whole bunch of people actually involved in the whole experience. They were, in total, those Allied Airmen who survived Buchenwald were in there 60 days. During that time, 2 of the 168 perished just through malnutrition and disease. They were lucky it wasn't a whole lot more. So they arrived there on the 20th of August, 1944, and it was early in the morning, as I understand it. So on exiting the train, just some of the things pertaining to Phil's leadership, that, as I mentioned before, there was a bewilderment, but he was the one who gathered them in. And he said it was very dangerous. If you fell over, the dogs chewed you. And they were, German shepherds who were, and there were a lot of them, and they were eager to release them on any prisoner that stepped out of line. So it was a really dangerous place. As Phil said, the first thing I saw as we arrived there was a wagon being towed by about half a dozen emaciated prisoners. He said they were being driven by a man with a whip. He said it was like out of a bad movie. He said, coming from New Zealand, I couldn't comprehend it. It was something so far from what I'd ever thought or seen in my life, people in striped garb being tortured like that. And he said, God knows what was on the wagon. When they entered the camp, there's all the anecdotes about smoke. The only way out is smoke out of the chimney. There was fear being put into the ranks as they walked along. They were waiting to be shaven, and disinfected, and that process was pretty dehumanizing, stripped, and then basically had that procedure group by group. And while they were awaiting that, Phil decided I had to do something. So he grabbed a guy by the name. He recognised this man because the Germans had started using him on the train journey. They'd asked, is there anyone here who speaks German among the prisoners? And this guy by the name of Splinter Spearenberg, who's really one of the unsung heroes. Spearenberg spoke Dutch, obviously. He was a Dutch pilot who fought with the RAF, and he'd been captured. But he also spoke German, and he spoke English, of course, as well. So he was able to translate for the Germans, and so Phil made use of him straight away. As soon as they got there, grabbed this guy, and he marched him up the front with him. They saluted the officer in charge, who was Schmidt at that time, the deputy commandant of the camp. And, he protested his line, we are prisoners of war. We are not, we're in the wrong place. We should be a bona fide prisoner of war. We have rights under the Geneva Convention, and we expect to be treated as such, And so these guys briefly considered that and said, well, we'll let you know in due course. And, he got back to his place. So again, he made a statement about leadership in front of many others. When they went into and we've only learned this very recently, when they went into, and that's through really going back and analysing Phil's old interviews, when they went into the place where you got shaved, he ran into this, he was tapped, he said, I was sitting there getting shaved, and I'd actually, I'd made my disapproval of everything's very apparent to the guys who were shaving us, who were Poles, who didn't care a bit. And he said he realised that if he kept moaning, he'd probably get shot, so he stopped. He said, next thing I get tapped on the shoulder by this guy, I said, look, I'm an Englishman. And it was this guy by the name of Christopher Burney. Now, Burney, intriguing man, he'd been a commando briefly at the start of the war, and then he'd been seconded into the SOE, the secret operational executive, not with E.O. Thomas's group, but with Group E, I think it was. And he was sort of sent on a mission to nowhere and got captured very quickly in France. He had spent 15 months in solitary confinement in Fresnes Prison, which was a story in itself, and it's lucky his biography's just been written. But he'd ended up he came to Buchenwald in January of 1944, so he had been there for several months, for 6 months or more, before Phil Lammerson's group arrived. In that time, because he had command of several languages, including Russian and French, of course. I think he'd learned Italian. He spoke Spanish fluently, and of course he learned German as well quickly in the camp. So he positioned himself to be able to move around the camp. I think the Germans felt that he was a guy who might be able to collect information for them, but he was intent on also helping new arrivals understand what was going on. And so Christopher Burney basically said to Phil Lammerson, you've got to be very careful who you talk to around here, but I'll keep in touch with you, and that was sort of the limit of that conversation. So he knew straight away that there were other people in the camp, who were kindred spirits, who actually knew something more about how the thing operated. And so they went to Little Camp, and there was the episode when they bought some soup. The guys hadn't been fed properly for days, and it was poor soup and bad bread. And they behaved like animals. They were almost fighting each other to get at the soup. They had no ways of dispensing it properly, and it was just a muddle. And Phil was appalled by it when he saw it happening. So during the night, he made inquiries quietly around the camp. They were stuck and they're wide open. They were outside for the first 8 days. They were in Buchenwald, out under the stars on what they called the rock pile, and on their bare feet. So no blankets, nothing. He said lucky it was midsummer. Even then the nights were cold. But he made inquiries to establish his ranking, his relative ranking. And so by morning he had a clearer picture of the fact that he was among the more senior guys in the group. And he realised, there were 168 airmen there in that group. So those people comprised 82 Americans, 48 British, 26 Canadian, 9 Australians, 2 New Zealanders, and 1 Jamaican. And I think those stats probably tell you why New Zealanders don't really know the story terribly well, because, Americans know it better than us. Just statistically, that's the reason. A lot of Americans have written about it. So, yeah, on the first morning they're in Buchenwald, Phil's going around to the guys, tapping on the shoulder, look, I want you around the rock pile. So he stood them all there at attention and said, look, gentlemen, we've got ourselves in a fine fix. This is a bad place. But we're airmen and we'll behave as our military training would expect, and we've got to work together. So right from the get-go, he sort of set his expectations. And he also said that he talked to some of the other senior officers who were happy to sort of, allow him to act in that capacity as the senior officer among them. So he said, we are prisoners of war, we're allied officers, we have rights under the Geneva Agreement, and we're not going to work for these guys. That was their mantra. We will not work. We're prisoners of war. He also put in place at their first meeting organisation. He got Tom Blackham, Second Lieutenant Tom Blackham, who went on to high levels of RAF after the war. I think he got right to Air Commodore before the end of his career in the military. So he sort of was Phil's 2IC in charge of the RAF guys, the Canadians, the British, the Australians, the Kiwis, and the Jamaican guy. And then eventually, it took a day or two, but he eventually got Merle Larson to be the leader of the Americans, who were a whole lot more difficult to manage. Phil talked, because a lot of the American guys had not been at the war very long. A lot of them were young men who were relatively new to combat, and so they hadn't had the experience of some of the other people in that particular group. So it took some time to consolidate a leader there, and it was Merle Larson who in the end got that responsibility, and Phil thought he did a really good job. So he told all of them, we're all in this. So, you just got to be vigilant, but don't go baiting the capos. Don't go making trouble, and no one's to escape. If we're going to plan escapes, it's going to be for all of us. It's all or no one, So there was that collective cohesion that was put in place. And a lot of the American guys who've written about this experience said, they went away from that experience that first day feeling a whole lot more empowered, that there was some positivity and something they could do to help their situation. So again, really intuitive leadership from Lammerson, but something that sort of worked effectively. So through the early days in the camp there, some of the things that happened, there was the daily appel that could go on for up to 3 hours, which they all, was basically the roll call. And as they said, if you were dead, they had to drag you out and prop you up while your name was called before you got thrown on a wagon. So it was a terrible event, really. He met up with, at that time, E.O. Thomas, who was under the alias of Dodkin. Now, Phil Lammerson had actually flown with a guy by the name of Kenneth Dodkin, and that was the alias that E.O. Thomas was using. And so right from the get-go, they didn't kick it off on a really good footing. E.O. Thomas was not quite 20 years older than Phil Lammerson. At the time this was happening, Phil Lammerson was a man of age 26. In fact, he had his 26th birthday while they were in the camp. E.O. Thomas was a man in his early 40s, so he was a man with a lot more world experience, and of course his whole experience in the war was one of a very powerful war story, unique story as an SOE agent. Along with Thomas, of course, there were 36 SOE special operation executives, with some really important people among those as well. And then after about 4 days into the camp, the Americans bombed the Gustav Works, which was, I think they all thought when it was happening, this is liberation happening. But in fact, they targeted it so well that the camp was relatively unaffected. But the Germans were, angered by this, and the Allied Airmen were very concerned that there would be reprisals. And when they got lined up and they were demanded to go and help, with the cleanup and the rescuing of injured and that from the site, they actually agreed to do that. But then the Germans came back to them. Pista, who was the commandant there, came back to them and said, now we will have a look at the people who can actually help us in the workplace again now. And that was work. So Phil Lammerson said, no, we're not going to do it. And that led to the first confrontation that became sort of legendary, where, both Pista and Schmidt were together confronting Lammerson, who'd actually said to one of the Capo guys, we're not going to work. So the Capo marched them over to these guys in front of everyone else. And Schmidt put the gun under Phil's chin like this, his Luger, cocked the Luger, put it under his chin like this. Said, you going to work or not? He said, no, we're prisoners of war, Geneva Convention, we don't work. It's the same old mantra, keep it simple. And, for a moment, Pista paused, and then he said, put the gun away. And so they accepted that, I guess they weighed out the collateral damage, if they'd murdered so many of Allied airmen who probably in their hearts knew were in the wrong place. So there was that huge moment,
Just to interrupt, that's a critical moment in his leadership, because if Phil backs down now, if he agrees to work, he kind of loses all credibility in a sense with his fellow prisoners. The Germans feel they've won there, but if he doubles down and still refuses to work, they could have shot him right there on a spot. That's a really important moment in everything for those other prisoners there and the Germans. It's a power struggle, isn't it? It's a who is ultimately in charge here.
As Phil said in his old age, the whole time, their whole intent was to try and break us mentally. You know, I think it was not Ed Carter, Chas Bowen, the American guy, who spoke about this to Mike Dorsey, said, you know, the SS expected us to be running around as a rebel, every man for himself, within days of being there. They're absolutely appalled that we were marching around. You know, we were singing our songs and marching as a squad. You know, they'd been put into squads and they were given duties like, you're looking after the soup today, or you're looking after making sure the few possessions we've got aren't stolen because there were 3,000 other people in the little camp stuck with them too, which was like a reception area in Buchenwald, you know. So they put structure and organisation in place that gave people purpose. And so you're absolutely right. Phil saved face, probably saved face with the Germans too. You know, as I said, Pista was an indecisive man. He was a guy who did things by the book. So if he hadn't got the order to shoot someone, he probably wouldn't have shot him anyway. But, you know, that didn't stop him trying to intimidate him. One of the interesting comments, you know, in later years came from Tom Blackham, you know, who, as I said, rose to high levels in the RAF after the war. You know, he said, you know, this courage and this just in-your-face leadership, you know, that Phil displayed was the reason they got out, you know, and he'd had a lot of time to reflect on it as well. And there's a very strong comment, if I can find it and get time, I'll read it out later. But yeah, you know, but basically, you know, in the time they were there, the pressure kept mounting all the time, you know, but they kept building networks within the camp. There was, you know, there was a group of people in what they called Block 50, which was the dare we say it, the Hygiene and Health Institute of the camp, which was, you know, everything but that, because they conducted the experiments on typhus and prisoners were selected as guinea pigs. They never came out alive, you know, that was known. So it was also the way that, Thomas got out of the camp in the end. But, you know, in there, Christopher Burney had links into that group of people. Now, there was also a guy by the name of Jan Robert in there. Now, he was a psychologist guy, but also a masseur. And then there was Alfred Balachowski, who was a former resistance worker, but also a very highly qualified French biotechnologist. And so he was a key person in the trialing of the typhus vaccines. And so these people were non-communists, and they were basically trying their best. The overall coordinator of that area was a guy by the name of Ding Schuler, SS officer Ding Schuler. And Eugene Kogan was another important character in there. That Phil never knew those two, but basically those two men were very close, and Ding Schuler had come around to the thinking that the Nazi cause was lost, and he was positioning himself for opportunity beyond the war at that time. So he was ready to listen to, you know, I guess a semi-compassionate voice. And so these guys were working whenever they could to try and make life a little bit better for people in the camp. So one of the important connections that Phil was able to make through Christopher Burney was with this guy, Jan Robert, and on to Alfred Balachowski. Now, these guys eventually became very important in getting the airmen out of the camp. So he also, during that time, Phil was actually, he said, you know, I spent a lot of time with the Russians, you know, the Russian communist military guys that were in the camp. He said, you know, these people were formidable characters, and they, with the help of interpreters, you know, they had a guy in their ranks who actually spoke Polish. So there was a Polish guy who helped the Russians, and so they got connections going with the Russians. And, you know, Phil actually insisted that these groups of people start getting organised. You know, you just couldn't sit around in the camp and think, well, one day someone's going to come and rescue us. We've got to be ready for whatever in case these guys go crazy. We've got to, you know, in case there's a, you know, attempted mass massacre or something, you know, with the advancing allies. So, probably the most important thing in that time was, Thomas started putting pressure on Phil to get his 36 SOE guys shifted over so they could join with the Allied Airmen. But Phil actually denied him that. He said, look, I can't do that because we're correctly prisoners of war, whereas you guys are basically saboteurs, So because of that different category, and it was something Phil realised he had to do, but he regretted having had to do it to the end of his days. Even to Mike Dorsey in his film, he said, I just wonder to this day whether I could have done something more for those guys, all of whom, apart from 3, were executed by the Gestapo, so by the SS. And eventually he came to a decision that because they weren't going out of the camp and work camps, and the opportunity to escape really just wasn't there, after talking in detail with the Russians about the plan that E.O. Thomas was trying to hatch, which was like a dramatic breakout, with a lot of collateral damage. But Phil wouldn't buy into that. He said, we've got to all get out. That was his standpoint, not just 1 or 2, but we need to all get out. And so he decided that they needed to get outside assistance. And I think it was with, it seems definite that it was with Christopher Burney's help that they wrote the letter. And it was through Belachowski and Jan Robert. And there were a couple of other blokes in there who had connections to the outside of the camp. They got a letter out that eventually found its way into the hand of some senior officers in the Luftwaffe. So while all this was going on, of course, in 2 bunches, the SS executed without any warning the SOE guys. The first bunch of 16 were hung, on the hooks with piano wire and left to struggle until they were dead. Brutal deaths, And after that first execution, E.O. Thomas went to ground. Basically, he was hidden in that block 50 and able to get out of the camp. Eventually walked out the main gate. Different story. So they sort of kept their hope. How did they keep their hopes up? There was agitation starting to happen in the ranks. The guys were getting frustrated, so they established this thing called the Concentration Buchenwald, or the Klb Club. Now, this is the one badge that Phil Lammerson wore with pride. He obviously valued what was done by those men. And what it did was engaged a whole lot of another tier of leadership in the camp, in the Allied group. One of those blokes is still alive in England, or Stanley Brooker, He turned 100 on Anzac Day. Amazing man, but he gave a different tier of people a purpose, and it was really about setting some goals for after the war and planning, reunions and that sort of thing. All positivity and all about hope. And so there was also a bunch of Danish policemen, about 160 officers, about the same number as the Allied Airmen arrived in that part of the camp, and they also brought food packages with them. So there was an opportunity around that, and also they were people who had really positive news about the war, an update, because they knew nothing of what was happening outside of Buchenwald. And then there was this amazing encounter that happened that made them think that maybe the letter that they got out of the camp to the Luftwaffe actually had got to some senior levels in the Luftwaffe. There was this officer by the name of Hans Trotloff. Now, he'd been actually a First World War flyer for the Germans, and he was a Luftwaffe officer who had become disillusioned by this time about the Nazi cause. And he took it upon himself, under the premise of going to check out the damage that had been done by the bombing at the Gestapo works, to go on his own and visit the Buchenwald camp. And so he went in his uniform, and you can see he wore the Iron Cross. He was a distinguished man. And he was walking at some distance from the wire beside the little camp within Buchenwald with an SS guard around him. And this United States guy by the airman by the name of Bernard Scharf, who spoke fluent German, and he was one of the rank and file there in the Allied Airmen group, he noticed the Iron Cross, and he thought, that's a senior officer. So he went over to the fence and he called out to him in German, "Sir, I need to speak to you," and he stood at attention and saluted. This guy stopped and came over to the wire, much to the frustration of the SS guards who were trying to push him away. And Sharp was able to tell him, look, there's Allied Airmen in this camp. They should be prisoners of war. A lot of them are getting sick and ill now, and we need to be out of here. Can you please do something about it? And Trotloff apparently took notes, made notes in a notebook about that. And that was a huge moment of hope for them. And so they didn't see any more of him, but it was within days of that the Luftwaffe, some senior officers from a nearby Luftwaffe camp or base came and said, look, these guys are coming out of it and we're sending them to a bona fide prison camp. So there'd been further setbacks in all this time. While that positivity was happening, there were also the bad things. The hospitalizations were increasing all the time. The guy, even Phil Lammerson himself, was starting to suffer with diphtheria, but it was like, it's over my dead body, I'm going to that hospital because it's just a death chamber, So they struggled on. As I said, they executed the second bunch of SOEs. Then Phil found out through those connections with Jan Robert that there'd been an execution order floating around with the Allied Airmen's names on it. And they knew this was serious stuff, and he kept that to himself. He never told anyone. He used discretion and said, well, I've got to keep the cohesion in this group no matter what, And he was criticised for that after the war by some, but as he said, you just can't tell people everything, So he took that one on the chin. And it was at that time that he got pulled out. And he didn't know, even I think at the end of the life, the real authority the officer has, but it was a young SS officer came and said to him, look, we're taking you out to shoot you in the morning. And he said, well, I want to speak to a senior officer. And they said, no, we're taking you out in the morning. So it duly happened. He was marched out. He said, you're causing trouble in the camp. And he said there would have been 20 guys there with guns. And they marched him out into a green patch by the forest around the edge of the camp, lined him up there. And, the rifles were raised. And this young officer said to him, well, have you got anything to say for yourself? And he said there was a dog there just about to bite me in half, leaping on the leash. He said I was more frightened of that than anything else. And this was where, the facetious Phil Lammerson came to the fore. He said, I didn't think it would take 20 of you to shoot me. But then he sort of said, well, if you shoot me today, you're going to be responsible for that. And so he then logically said to this guy, you've got a chance here to be an honourable person or a dishonourable person. You're going to lose the war anyway. So it doesn't really matter. If I'm dead, someone else will take over, but you'll be accountable for this. And Phil, and this was Phil Lammerson. Remember, when we were kids, Phil Lammerson, you look at him and he'd look back at you and you'd think he was looking into your soul. He had those sort of eyes, he had a presence. And I think in that moment in time, he was able to, he said, I looked at that young man, the SS officer, and I could tell he wasn't a bad man. Here he is about to order these 20 guys to shoot him. He was just following orders. He said, I could see he was just following orders. So he said, he looked at me for about half a minute and then he stood the guys down. He said, if you want to be honourable today, you can stand those guys down and march them back to the camp. He said he waited about another half minute and did exactly that. And he said, I didn't step back, and that's what saved my life. If I'd stepped back, they would have let the dogs onto me. They wouldn't have to shoot me. He was very, very brave, very, very courageous. Now, only Phil was there to witness that. That whole event was his recount, and he recounted it vividly to Warren Barton, about that moment in time. So that was why we called his biography I Would Not Step Back, because, that really became the moment of life or death. And, of course, even the guys who were in his group didn't actually know that. Didn't even know that had happened. He said, by then I was so sick with diphtheria, I could hardly speak. It was getting pretty grim. So within days of that, these Luftwaffe officers arrived. There was a bit of consternation around the signing forms and that at the end, where some of the airmen refused to sign and some argued that Lammerson was out of order and making them sign it. But basically he said to them, well, look, I'm signing, we need to be out of here. No matter what you sign today is going to have no effect on the outcome of the war. He said, some of them said, they're only trying to get intelligence off us, blah, blah, blah. But he said, these were honourable men who came to the camp. And he said, you could tell, even when they gathered us up, it was raining and they didn't make a stand there. They took us into a theatre and we sat down. We actually sat down on seats for the first time since we'd arrived, you know. So there was this incredible interplay of, you know, kindred people suddenly coming to the rescue, you know, that those honour among, you know, the air fraternity. And so, yeah, they were entrained to different prisoner of war camps, and, you know, Phil saw out the remainder of the war in a prisoner of war camp. Yeah, as I say, I think 14 of them sort of were still in the hospital at the time the big group left, but they joined them at the other prisoners of war camps in due course. So, yeah, remarkable story. And, you know, there were also aspects of it of after what they left, when they left Buchenwald, but there was nothing to compare with the story there. And as I said before, you know, the comments Phil made about Buchenwald are poignant. You know, it was a hell of a place, you know. Whatever you hear about Buchenwald, it was worse. And then he goes on and he said, I always felt responsible. All the time they were just trying to break us, to break our spirit. And, you know, that's him. That's how he looked at you, Phil, when he was dead serious about it, you know.
And it just started because he was on that railway, you know, the first day on the railway that he kind of stepped up a little bit to try and organize things. Then suddenly a few weeks later, he's in charge of everything. It's not like he was assigned this or he thought about, I want to take this career. It was just an accidental type of stepping up and being responsible, and it ends up being a position of huge responsibility. And yeah, absolute testament to the man.
There's a story that's not really well documented, and it was to do with the Americans. And he said the first guy that I sort of put in, you know, as a senior officer among the Americans, he never named him. We still don't know who that person is. He said he'd been doing the job for a couple of days, but he said it was really grim. I was watching it. He said he had no respect. He said, you know, when you're taken away from the military base and you don't have the surrounding protocols, you know, of punishments, I suppose, or things that keep people in line. He said, when it's just up to you and your personality, it's a hell of a lot different. And he said, this guy came to me and he said, look, I'm not coping. And Phil said, I could see he wasn't coping. So I said, I'd been looking around and thinking, well, who's the next guy in line? And this is where he spied out Merle Larson. He'd actually spent a bit of time in the RAF at the very start of the war, which is interesting, with the Canadians. And he was one, he said, this Merle Larson was one tough guy. You know, he just knew instinctively the right man to have in the job after he got to know them a wee bit after that. So after about 2 or 3 days, he said, I had to gather the American guys together and I sat them down and I said, look, from now on, that's the guy you're going to listen to. And if you're not listening to him, you talk to me. And so, you know, there was that sense of authority that was accepted. You know, it was almost like this guy actually can see things that we don't see. And I think if we hang in there, we're going to get there. But towards the end, I think there were some doubts, you know, that maybe we're not going to get out of this place. So, yeah, look, 60 days was a long time. They lost a lot of weight. You know, they were emaciated by the time they came out. What I did do, and it's probably not a good idea to go through it now, but I'm just sort of thinking that there's a whole lot of aptitudes there that the modern people who talk about leadership look at, you know, and there's some very intriguing little anecdotes that tuck into each of those categories. And quite frankly, Phil Lammerson ticks all those boxes. If you analyse those activities throughout Buchenwald as we now understand them, you know, he intuitively ticked most of those boxes. So I just sort of thought a little bit about managing trauma to finish off. You know, as he said, I've always tried to put in later years, I've always tried to put what happened behind me and to get on with my life. But I do have memories, particularly of things that like Buchenwald. And yeah, you know, one of probably the most important thing to Phil throughout his life was, you know, Joan, who he married before they went to war. That's a picture of him just when he got back from the war. And that's at their 60th wedding anniversary. You know, they were married 65 years, had family, grandchildren, you know. And so that was really the most important thing in him coping with the aftermath of the war. And, you know, he also found solace in his farming as well. You know, he had the terrible experience of losing his youngest son to a road accident when the boy was 21 years of age. And as the family said, Phil said publicly it was worse than Buchenwald, coping with that. So it's good that people who are coping with road accident, tragedies know that it's really bad. And as the family said, that was the closest we ever saw to our father being broken. But it was, again, the family and his farming interests that got him through it. And so, during the war, he acknowledged he experienced fear. There was, as he said, there was a guy that he spoke to in the prisoner of war camp after Buchenwald. He said he was an older man who'd been a tail gunner, British tail gunner. He said he'd also been a ground soldier in the First World War. And this man said to him, every time I got on the aeroplane to go on a raid, it was worse than going over the top in the trenches at Passchendaele in the First World War. So people can read into that exactly what it means.
Yeah.
As he said, what got them through was their training. They knew their role, they knew their responsibility, and they had that sense of duty. Despite what was going on around them, you focused on what you had to do. A lot of those old flyers said that, because it was really frightening stuff. And Phil Lammerson said, you were frightened. He said, flak spoiled guy, facetious, The flak was really bad. If you could hear the bang above the engines, you knew it was close. And then he added, it spoiled guy forks forever for me. So, that was his way of explaining, so that facetious episode, it flipped the story. Sometimes that worked, sometimes it didn't. Time out, he got the opportunity a couple of times to go to Scotland to a farm there. He got to know the people. When he got a farm of his own, he called it Glendevin, the name of the farm that he used to go to in Scotland, to get right away from the war and unscramble his brain, so he had that opportunity. And then there were the occasions when Phil just took license and went AWOL. And there was a classic example very early on in December 1941 where they'd been asked to fly a mission when they were trialling the oboe radar systems, and they asked a crew from 218 to take the device in a Wellington bomber to guide Lancasters from a couple of other squadrons in onto the target at Brest, where the Germans had the big boats for the Atlantic War. And Phil said, we dropped an engine on the way. We were almost to target, and we dropped one engine on this plane just seized. And so he said we had to drop our load, and we finally got back to England. The waves were lapping the bottom of the plane. He said I came up over the and managed to land at an airfield near Bath, and he said I only got hedge hopping, and I saw a plane going in just in a silhouette, and I followed it in. He said we were done for all dinners, So they offered to send a plane down the next morning. He said, no, don't bother, we'll catch a train. So he said, I'd done a whip round with my crew and realised we had about 160 pounds between us. So he said, we were still in our flying suit. We jumped on the train, we got to London, we thought, bugger it, we're going to take some leave. So they bailed off the train. They went to the Strand Hotel, hotel on the Strand, Flash Hotel. And as he said, it was chaos. They were drunk for 3 days. Until the military police finally caught up with them and took them back to base. But, that was the sort of thing, but he got away with that because he had a good work ethic. Spent a bit of time in the cooler. But, look, interesting the way he dealt with it. He was a bit of a larrikin, right through his life. That was it. Post-war, he admitted being a bit jumpy. He got disillusioned with the military and politicians. He'd been offered jobs. These things didn't happen. He experienced sleeplessness. The family used to say that, even in his old age, if you knew he'd be talking away and then he would go quiet, it was better to just leave him. And then, so he had those sort of issues. Big saviour was his discovery of his passion, rediscovering passion for farming, being a man alone out there. He contributed hugely back to the old training farm that he'd been in when he was a kid as an administrator. Interesting, he never ever flew an aeroplane again, never attended any war commemorations, never wore his war medals, didn't even know where they were, never talked about his war experiences until his very old age. But he retained a huge lifelong aversion and intolerance towards bullies, and his grandchildren had anecdotes around that. He did, from time to time meet old comrades who'd been particularly in the bombers, and as the family said, they'd retire to a room quietly in the house by themselves with a bottle of whiskey, which they'd empty, and that was sort of clearing mines. He acknowledged in his old age, that the losses, as we talked about to start with, were huge, and that he thought about them a lot. And the kids, as I said, still experienced a lot of that larrikin side of Phil Lammerson. He was always had a larrikin sort of sense of humour. So an amazing man in so many ways, and I think a model to us in the way he actually recovered from that terrible experience. So many of them were so badly affected, by it. So just in concluding, we honour the fact that he lived to an old age. He died in 2012. He was a lucky man. He managed to work on his farm until he was probably in his late 80s. He died at home. And so it's just been a pleasure and a privilege to have worked with the family to get his biography out there. As I say, we've found out a whole lot more since that book came out to add to the story, but that's just how it is. And as I say, our chat tonight hopefully has encouraged others to have a think about maybe people in their own family background who are involved in some way in the Second World War, because they're out there, and a lot of them were like Phil Lammerson. That it's not a denial; it's sort of it's a removal from removing yourself from the interface with it that became the way of coping. So just as sometimes it's amazing the folk who are out there and close by.
Well, I mean, all I can say is thank you. I mean, it's an hour and a half well spent, and it's one of those stories that I think it encompasses all things. It's an aviation story. It's a story of a guy from the colonies. It's also a story of the Holocaust in a sense, personal endurance. It's also deals with PTS and experiencing things after. And when you listed those, the quiet spells and not going to war commemorations, that's your classic PTS. That's your classic guy who's struggling with everything. And so it's a lot of different things can be taken away from this story. So I'll remind everybody watching, folks, the link to the Phil Lammerson project is in the description below. The link to purchasing the book is available on the website there. There are these other documentaries and books that Mike mentioned there that have this story in it. The Yeo Thomas White Rabbit story is worth investigating. So is Buchenwald as another place in its own right. So, well, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. If anyone is out there watching this, who are, we've got Stuart watching, whose father was in 218 Squadron. You welcome people making contact with you who might have a connection with the squadrons Phil was with, or might have a connection with with Buchenwald. So you welcome people contacting you. Is that correct?
Absolutely, Paul. And look, thank you so much for the opportunity. As I say, we do run a fairly active Facebook page if people want to dial up Phil Lammerson project there. And also we have a website, phillammerson.com. The book itself is also available in the ebook form for people who want it. The original collector's book, which was a hard-covered item, now is basically no longer available. This is a beautifully set-out book. So, it was more available in New Zealand than it was elsewhere. But there were about 1,400 copies of that printed and sold earlier on. So, if folk, keep your eyes out. Those things might be coming up too around the place as second-hand books.
Well, again, brilliant, Mike. I mean, I get a lot of people noticing the fact that I use sometimes big kind of best-selling authors and historians. I like using those guys. I use people in the middle of their MA or PhD dissertations. I like people like that. But I love people like yourself who just clearly from the beginning to the end, your enthusiasm, your respect, your passion for the subject is coming through in spades, and just what an inspiration. I can tell that he's been departed for a decade, but he's still an inspiration on your life. And I'm guessing that in that community there, his legend stands tall. There's a Phil Lammerson way of doing things, I think, that must be influencing people in your part of New Zealand.
I think so. People in New Zealand, admire hugely Edmund Hillary, who's, internationally known for climbing exploits. Quintessential New Zealander, the understatement. The Kiwi guy who understates things, and he very much falls into that category. Yeah.
Yeah, no.
And a joy to be able to spread it through this media as well tonight, Paul. So thank you for that opportunity.
I will bring things in. So I'm just going to take the screen for a second while I remind people what's coming up. So tomorrow, unless I suddenly schedule a show tomorrow, there is nothing tomorrow, but there are 2 shows on Thursday. So we have another New Zealand at War show in the morning, or morning UK time. Then in the evening, we've got another show there. Joe McCabe from Iron is coming on to talk about an amazing American cameraman from World War II. So another odd show coming up. And then we've got another one coming up this week that I'll mention is The English GI. This is an incredible graphic novel written by the grandson of a young guy from Yorkshire who ended up going to the USA and ended up joining the American military and serving as a GI in the ETO. So that's a great show coming up. So as usual, if you've stuck with us, please don't forget to like what we're doing, share what we're doing, consider becoming a patron or a channel member. And as I said, check out the links to the Phil Lammerson project there in the description below. See what you can do, spread the word, because it's an amazing story. But I'm going to bring Mike back on screen, basically to say good evening. It's nearly 11 o'clock. There's bedtime soon.
Yeah, as I say, it's still going. You know, may be outside. So yeah, it's that sort of night here, Paul.
Brilliant.
Well, hey, look, thanks for your time, mate. Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
It's been brilliant talking to you. So this is Paul Woodhouse from World War II TV saying I'll see you all again next time, folks. So cheers, everybody. Thank you. Bye.
Bye for now.